Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Llewellyn. I run the services, activities, and so on that you'll find at MedCommsNetworking.com. So services for people who work in and around the global community of people who work in and around medical communications, medical education, medical publishing, and associated businesses. Importantly, we provide a lot of information for people who are interested in knowing more about our business. So, for instance, if you go to firstmedcommsjob.com, you'll find lots of hopefully helpful information, insights about getting a career, maybe as a medical writer, account manager, or whatever. But lots and lots of information. And these webinars are great, and we're recording them. And there's lots more recordings over at NetworkPharma TV. So there's more than 400 videos now. So lots and lots of content to go and have a look at. Go to medcommsnetworking.com or give me a shout, and hopefully there's lots of useful resource for you. As I say, these webinars are great. We can get people involved from all over the world, and we've got another useful audience involved, again, from all over the world. So they're great, and I'm very pleased today we're going to be hearing from my four panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. We're talking about opening up information, accessibility of information, which is really important to wider audiences and in particular to patients. But today we're specifically talking about the podcasting type of solution. So I'm going to hand over to Catherine to kick us off. Members of the audience, remember that you've got two text boxes to contribute to the conversation. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Peter. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to be talking to you about plain language podcasts. So before we get started, we'll just introduce the panelists. So myself, I'm Catherine Elliott. I'm a Senior Scientific Director, Patient Partnerships at Envision the Patient, which is part of the Envision Pharma Group. So as part of Envision the Patient, we support clients and internal teams with developing plain language content using best practice, but also thinking about how to bring in the patient voice into a wide variety of projects, including publications. So Simon.
Hi everybody, I'm Simon Stones. I am a medical writer with Envision Pharma Group. So I work on a variety of medical communications and publications work. And I'm also a patient advocate with around 10 years experience supporting and empowering patients and caregivers with lived experience.
And hi everyone, I'm Niamh Clark. I'm the Associate Publishing Manager for the ADIS journals, which is a portfolio of 32 titles focusing on drug and disease therapy, published by Springer Nature, the wider publisher. We've been publishing podcast articles for a few years and also patient authored content. So yeah, bringing all of that together today.
And hello, everyone. My name's Caroline Helford. I'm the Development Director for Medical Education at Springer Healthcare, which is part of the wider Springer Nature Group. So my role is really, I have a dual role, really. I work with sponsors, but I also work with our expert in-house educational teams to identify unmet educational needs and to provide the best solutions. So we have a wide range of educational solutions. We have an award-winning CME IME team. We do a bit more, we do non-accredited education, we do MedComms as well. And of course, we've got the Springer Nature portfolio. So yeah, I'm really excited about this webinar because plain language patient-centered podcasts are something that we've seen a lot of impact with.
Great, thank you. So before we get talking about the podcast itself, there's a bit of background. So basically, scientific information is increasingly of interest to a broad audience, including non-specialist HCPs and lay audiences. So we know that more people from across breadth of attendees are actually attending congresses, and actually congresses are actually having tracks or sessions aimed at a broader range of attendees beyond the specialist HCPs. We also know that patients are seeking health-related information online, and they're finding this in a variety of different locations, including articles in scientific journals. So in order to meet the needs of these diverse audiences, we need to ensure that accurate scientific information is easily accessible and easy to understand and available in a variety of formats. And one of these formats is the plain language summary, which accompanies an article. And it's interesting to see, it's been really great to see that there have been increasing numbers of articles being published with a plain language summary over the last few years, and sort of supporting broadening the audience of scientific data. We know that plain language summaries are valued by patient organisations, but also by HCPs. And interestingly, on the right-hand side here, that the data there was from not just physicians, but also nurse practitioners and physician assistants. So broadening the audience for scientific content is actually also something that's been brought to the latest update of Good Publication Practice, or GPP 2022. And as part of GPP 2022, we can see there that PLS, they recommended that PLS should be considered for all publications as they support the communication of biomedical research to many audiences. GPP 2022 also updates that value the input of patients into publications, including patients as authors, which again has been great to see. So podcasts have been increasingly used as a way of accessing content over the last few years. And as Niamh mentioned as well, there have been expert-led podcasts summarising the latest data at scientific congress that's been published, and these are peer-reviewed and citable publications. So whilst these were with our HCP authors for an HCP audience, we wondered, was there an opportunity to do this with patient and HCP authors in plain language and for a broader audience, including patients? And the answer to this, fortunately, was yes. So this I will now hand over to Simon and Niamh to talk about the process that was taken to get this published.
Thank you, Catherine. So our rationale for this plain language podcast really drilled down to 5 key points. And firstly, people are using podcasts to empower and engage others. Now, I could give a list of different podcasts. I think one which may resonate with lots of people is You, Me and the Big C, which the late Dame Deborah James, Rachel Bland and Lauren Mahone so eloquently authored. And I think a lot of people have been touched by those kinds of podcasts. I think it just resonates with us and the importance of using this medium, which is increasingly popular, amongst a deluge of information, and also what some people might say increasingly less concentration span. So we want to really drill information home to people in an accessible format. And as Catherine already alluded to, peer-reviewed podcasts have already been developed with specialist healthcare professionals. And while that data may be of interest to a broader audience, the language may not necessarily be accessible to everyone who may access that content. And while plain language summaries are great resources, and it's great to see the increasing numbers, summarising clinically related information, plain language summaries don't tend to have an awful lot of context, which is what people often like to see, and which is something podcasts can offer. And so we came to the decision that we needed a credible, peer-reviewed and citable piece of content that's appropriate for a broader audience, including lay audiences. And also the importance of those kinds of podcasts educating healthcare professionals as well with less familiar experience of the therapy area. So I'm going to summarise very briefly the process that we went through to develop our podcast last year, which summarised content at ESMO 2021, the European Society for Medical Oncology Congress, which took place in September of last year. Niamh will touch on some of the logistics from the journal point of view, but I'm going to touch on more of from the perspective of the agency and from the authors. This was the first plain language podcast that we worked on, so the timeline is an estimate, and our experience was that this took 6 months. Again, this is a ballpark figure and was a new experience for both us as the agency and also working with the journal and the authors. And we really separate the process into 3 different stages: pre, peri and post-congress. So at pre-congress, we worked with our authors to identify the authors who would take part in the podcast and who felt comfortable speaking, as well as the target congress that would be mentioned in the podcast. Once those were firmed up, we looked at roles and responsibilities to make sure that all that was very clear in plain language for both the patient advocate and healthcare professional author. And we also discussed the podcast objectives. And again, this was an example of that iterative development of going from a broader topic. So the initial topic was looking at all GU cancers, and the decision was to focus on bladder and kidney cancer simply because of time, as I will touch on shortly. After those decisions were made, we sent a pre-submission inquiry to the journal to see if this was of interest, and thankfully it was. And we were able to move to the next stage. And that really was looking at the sessions which would be addressed in the podcast. And as you will know, with congresses, there is so many different sessions which you want to cover, and it is quite a difficult decision to narrow that focus down so you provide a broad overview of the topic, but also with concrete information which people can discuss. So with our patient and healthcare professional author, we identified those sessions and supported them in identifying the ones which would be of most interest to the wider audience, and that was very much aided by the programme which was available and the abstracts book. After that, the authors attended the Congress, and we supported them in providing templates so they could easily capture content which would aid the later steps, and also to help them reflect on some of the discussions which they had during the Congress. Once ESMO was over, we sat down with our patient and healthcare professional authors to develop an outline based on their reflections and content which they captured. We submitted this to the journal for approval, and were then able to progress from an outline to a discussion guide, which really firmed up the discussions which would take place during the podcast. And again, that was all done with our authors, fully collaborative, to identify what would be in this discussion guide. After this step, the discussion guide went to the journal for peer review. We then received feedback and was able to work with the authors to finalise the discussion guide and move ahead with the recording. Once the recording took place, we prepared a transcript, also a glossary. Again, we tried to make sure the conversation was in plain language, but as with any clinically related topic, you are going to get maybe the odd word in there which may not be accessible to a wider audience. So we felt a glossary was really important to make sure that those terms were discussed. All of those files were submitted to the journal for a final peer review, and following that, we were able to proceed with publication. So the podcast is published as an open access article on Springer Link, and the podcast is also available on various different streaming platforms, including Spotify. After publication, the journal and the authors were able to share the podcast with their networks. And then again, as I mentioned, third-party platforms spotlighted the podcast. And we're continuing to monitor metrics, as Neither will touch on shortly. So just to give you 6 key considerations from our experience of working on this podcast is firstly, to make sure you identify your target audience. You want to make sure that the scientific data being discussed is of interest to a broader audience, aside from expert healthcare professionals. And for that, you may want to looking at different types of tracks, such as patient advocacy tracks and the health professionals supporting clinician doctors, where there's a track for maybe nurses and other allied health professionals. So you want to make sure that you're reaching a wider audience and bringing things which may not be immediately of interest or initially thought of for those audiences. And then the topic, you want it to be of interest to a wider audience. So content needs to be focused so that you have a good discussion, but it also needs to be of interest to a broader population of people to make sure that that is accessible. And you need to use plain language throughout. You want the conversation to be accessible to everybody. And if there are words in there, as I already alluded to, then that's a place for maybe a glossary, very brief, but to make sure that those terms are discussed and mentioned so that everybody can access the content. Timing is really important, and you want it to be kept tight so that the audience remains engaged. So the question to ask is the podcast less than 30 minutes, i.e. commuting distance? Anything over 30 minutes and you're potentially going to lose interest. So, the ideal is 20 to 30 minutes where you capture people's attention, which is difficult when you are summarising a big oncology congress, for example. That was something which we found challenging, but again was aided by the narrower focus on the topics. You really want to make sure that you start early in the process and ensure that authors have time to commit. And this comes back to very clear and open communication with authors. So making sure that they were available in the period of the Congress and then before and after to make sure the discussion guide could be reviewed and approved and that the podcast, once transcribed, was approved. And that also means making sure that authors are aware of what's required of them to proceed. And then I think one of the most important parts of the podcast is conversational versus sticking to the script. And we've got to remember this is a peer-reviewed podcast. So the conversation does need to follow that discussion guide, But you need to make sure that the discussion guide has enough flexibility to allow that conversation to take place. And you want the interaction between the authors to be natural. And we found that was really important by bringing the authors together very early on and continually, so that they built up trust and that dialogue, so that they could really have a conversation, whilst also giving them the key points to make sure that the conversation broadly followed the discussion guide. I shall hand over to Niamh for the practicalities from the journal perspective.
Great, thanks, Simon. Yes, so firstly, I'm going to go through, I suppose, the logistics of doing any podcast article, but obviously this is applicable to plain language podcast articles involving patient authors. We follow a 7-step process with these. A lot of this will be quite similar to sort of your standard manuscript, but there are some key differences with a podcast article. And I'm also going to touch on the key differences between a plain language patient authored podcast article versus a HCP-led podcast article as well. So firstly, pre-submission inquiries are vital for podcast articles. The way that we work is that all of them are directed to myself, and I then contact all of our relevant editors to assess essentially which journals would be most interested in this, send over those details for you to then discuss with authors which journal they might like to focus in on. For the inquiry, these don't need to be really long. What we need really is what the proposed topic is, maybe what the key aims of the particular podcast article are, and details of the authors are really important as well. And then we'll come back to you in as little as 24 hours, but roughly within 2 to 3 working days with the journals that are interested, and maybe any queries that they have or suggestions for what else could be included. Following this, so as Simon kind of touched on before, we then encourage sort of an outline or discussion guide to be submitted formally to the journal that the authors have chosen to submit to. We do have some examples of the kind of discussion guides from the podcast article perspective. So if this is of interest, then please feel free to contact me and I can send over example versions that we have. But really what these should include is, as Simon kind of alluded to, these need to contain what the conversation is planning to be, but it shouldn't be a script, because we want to keep these as naturally sounding as possible to keep our audiences engaged. If you're planning to follow an interview style format, then interview questions would be great, and then sort of bullet pointed what the responses would be, and any references as well that are relevant towards this should be included at that stage too. And then we go on to peer review. So I'm going to touch a little bit more on what the differences are, because peer review is one of the key differences between maybe a plain language podcast article and a regular podcast article. But so they're peer reviewed by 2 experts, as with at least 2 experts, as with any other manuscript that our journals would publish. And then we'll return the peer review comments within 2 to 6 weeks, dependent on which journal you've selected. So then the authors will go away and create their podcast. At this stage also, we'll ask for a verbatim transcript to be written after the podcast has been recorded. So this is what makes up sort of the written published content that's associated with the podcast articles. So we have got a QR code for an example, just in case you can't really quite visualize how these look or how these work, for you to click through and take a look at the particular example that we're talking about here. But they are made up of the audio and then a written transcript underneath. So at this stage, we'd ask for the authors to write a verbatim transcript of the podcast and submit that formally back to the journal, at which stage we'll do a second round of peer review. So this round of peer review is more to make sure that the authors haven't strayed really massively away from the approved outline, make sure that they've adhered to it. It's quite a quick round of peer review, sort of around 1 week, and we'll approach the original reviewers that we'd worked with for the first round to do this stage. And then once everyone's reviewed, everyone's happy, we'll move to publication. So we'll formally accept and publish, and we'll publish within 2 to 3 weeks of the point of acceptance. And Simon kind of already said a few of the places where we do publish. So we publish on SpringerLink, which is Springer Nature's platform for our ADIS journals. So they'll be published online first, and then they'll be assigned to a regular issue because they are included as a regular paper, like any other paper would be. They are then put onto Figshare as well, which is the supplementary material platform that, that we use. And then we also do include them on places like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So we use a podcast distribution platform called Libsyn, which essentially pushes the podcast out to all of the major podcast platforms. So Spotify and Apple Podcasts aren't the only ones, but obviously they're two of the major ones. And they're indexed on PubMed. So as they are citable, have their own DOI in a regulatory for the journal, they're the same as any other publication we do, which means that they get pulled through onto PubMed as well. So as I mentioned, the kind of key differences are with the peer review, and it's more the peer reviewers. Because these are plain language, we review them the same way that we review a lot of the other plain language content that we do. So ADIS are a big champion of plain language summaries. We've been doing them for a really long time. And we have lots of processes in place in terms of how these are reviewed. And this is kind of then mirrored with our plain language podcasts. So we will invite expert reviewers to check accuracy, balance, but what we'll also invite, and by expert reviewers, I mean sort of obviously specialist HCP reviewers, but we'll also invite patient advocate reviewers or patient reviewers. We're very lucky to have some well-known patient advocates on our editorial boards. I think Trishna, we're very lucky to have Trishna on the board of one of our journals. I know she's watching us currently, but we also have editorial experts maybe from other therapy areas. So we found that's a really good way to check for plain language understanding, is to maybe take some of the experts from, say, dermatology and ask them to review our, say, cardiology content. So getting different perspectives from that way as well. And we'll also work with plain language experts too. So once we've published, kind of beyond the publication, it's really key, obviously, not just to publish and wait for things to happen, is to be active, both from the journal side, and we'll actively encourage our authors to be active with sharing as well. So we use sort of journal table of contents notifications. So when new issues are compiled, emails will go out to our subscribers or people who are signed up for the eTalk alerts to say, you know, these podcast articles are available. But we'll also use Twitter and LinkedIn and encourage the authors to share. We'll give them tips on how to share also, and we can take sort of requests for specific Twitter accounts to be tagged into anything that we share. For example, use relevant hashtags. We give the opportunity for the authors to suggest wording for tweets, but that's not mandatory. You don't have to provide that, but we do give that opportunity. And then it's really important to sort of track the metrics. So the metrics that we're tracking for all podcast articles, but especially for this example and other ones like this, is we're looking at the access and the downloads across all the different platforms that we're publishing on. But we're also looking at things like the altmetric score. So altmetric score is a great way to see how an article's been taken up and the conversation that's going on around it. And in fact, quite a few of our manuscripts or papers that have the highest altmetric scores tend to have patient authors, largely because, you know, the networking, the networks that these patient authors have built up, and that perspective that they're adding that's so important to the conversation. There's lots of great discussions that go on around those pieces. We also are looking at, you know, what's the source of the listener or reader? Where are they getting to the podcast from? Are they using social media, Google, PubMed, you know, news articles? Where are they coming from? And also the geographic location to sort of see what areas this might be being picked up more. We do also, that's not on the side, we can look at how long people are spending on the pages, whether or not, you know, they're staying to listen to the end, how many people are clicking on the audio to listen to it, or maybe how many people are choosing to read instead, because obviously, you know, podcast articles are great for that engaging way to, you know, to do your commute or go to the gym and listen to your article. But there are still plenty of people who would much rather just read. And because we have the transcript, which has the sort of broken down, it's quite a nice, easy read because it's broken down by speaker. And I think there's just a little pop-up here just with the metrics for this particular case study. So this article had 2,500 accesses in 8 months, which is a really great metric. We're really pleased with that. So yeah, so if you do want to listen to this particular case study, there's a QR code and link available here to click through. And I'll pass over to Caroline now.
Thank you, Niamh. So I just wanted to broaden this discussion out because, I mean, these are great examples of patient-led podcasts. I've seen many examples of podcasts like this that go beyond standard publications that have been really impactful. So I wanted to highlight this example on screen, which was, this was 4 podcasts that was part of a blended learning CME, that's continuing medical education program, to educate healthcare professionals that to identify this rare disease called fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, FOP. So I've got the educational goals on the slide here. It was really, the program was to raise awareness of this rare disease and the impact on patients' lives, to improve healthcare professionals' diagnostic competency and accuracy, to educate them on best practice with patient management, and crucially, in this rare population, to help healthcare professionals avoid doing mistreatment and harm to patients. As for anyone that knows about this rare disorder, it's if you don't treat the patients in the right way, it can adversely affect their health. So yeah, the podcasts were a key part of this program, not the only part, and crucially, the content was co-created and delivered in plain language by experts and patients. Next slide. So for those of you that are not familiar with how CME programs are delivered, this is a bit of a background just to help highlight the patient's key role in it. So if we're working from left to right, all CME programs start with an independent needs assessment, which is done by us at Springer Healthcare. This is where we find out where the knowledge gaps are, which groups would benefit most from education, and which media types would be best to reach, engage, and change the healthcare community. Once we know what the educational needs are, we work with instructional design to make sure that the materials are optimal to meet the learning objectives. Now, once we've done that, we then identify and recruit the leading experts in the field. So these are the FOP experts on screen. It's usually led by an editorial director. And in this case, well, the experts have the learning objectives, so they know what they need to do, but they really lead what goes into the materials, because there's no one better than the experts to know who needs educating and what they need to hear. And in this instance, crucially, the experts were adamant that it was the patients and capturing their patient voices in plain language that were going to be crucial for this program. So next slide. And this is what the final educational piece looked like. So we delivered 4 plain language patient-led podcasts. Each was an expert talking to a patient, and in one case, it was a patient and their family. And this is what the podcasts were covering: personal narratives, so the patient's own experiences in experiencing symptoms, challenges that they face in terms of just normal living everyday life, getting a correct diagnosis, actual real life, very impactful examples of the experience of mistreatment and actually the healthcare implications that had based on being treated by doctors that were not aware of this rare disease. And then there was lots of time for the patients to talk about what was important to them and their families in terms of getting the best out of life, and their opinions on what they need from experts in terms of care, advice, support, and knowledge. And ultimately, the background's objective of all 4 podcasts was to help educate healthcare professionals as what they can learn from patients and their parents or caregivers. So next slide, please. In terms of CME and IME, measuring the impact of education is one of the key tenets of what we do. So we don't just deliver the education, we have to sort of find devices to measure what impact we've had. And this particular program and these podcasts have had a huge impact. So following up months after the publication of these podcasts, which were published on our educational portal, but also on platforms like Spotify, we could see measurable improvements in healthcare professionals' confidence in accurately diagnosing, in confidently, appropriately managing people with this rare disease. And the feedback was in part that the podcast and the patient voice were one of the most impactful parts of the program. We also engaged with the patients to get their feedback on how it was to participate in this programme and their perceived impact in delivering this education. We've got lots of really great quotes, but I've just put 2 on screen here. One said, educational is vital to help healthcare professionals understand FOP, and who better to express the condition like someone like myself who lives with it every day. And in terms of the standard metrics that you'd expect to measure, we had high audience engagement on all platforms, which was really great because with rare diseases, it's quite challenging to reach the right audience, but we know that we've done this. The feedback also was the patient voice was crucial in achieving the objectives. And the broader blended learning programme, which included lots of different materials, as well as the podcasts, the broader programme did actually win a Communique Award for Excellence in Professional Education. So I hope that really shows you, really demonstratively how patient voices can create impact in publications. So the key takeaways before we hand back to Peter for the Q&A, we are seeing that plain language patient-centered podcasts are becoming increasingly common, not just in journal publications, but across the educational spectrum. And they are, as all the presenters have said today, they are excellent at educating a range of stakeholders. Now, healthcare professionals are the core audience, certainly for our CME and IME and for the journals, but we can't get away from the fact that open access means that everyone is looking for education, and they are great at being able to reach lay audiences and patients. The multiple platforms is key for podcasts. I heard a quote recently to say you've got to educate the audiences where they are, and not all audiences are going to be looking at the peer-reviewed literature. So, Apple, Spotify, Deezer, those platforms are all important too. Plain language podcasts are clear and digestible. We have metrics to show that the content is valuable and impactful. And I think this webinar is really timely in terms of the recent GPP guidance for patient centricity and patient authorship. Now I'm going to hand back to Peter for the audience Q&A.
You will if I can unmute myself. Okay, cool. Thank you, everybody. A reminder to the audience, we've got a couple of chat boxes here, a chat box and a Q&A box. Do put some questions. We've had some come in already. Questions, observations, comments. We'll try and include this in the conversation, which we'll have over the next few minutes, okay? So please feel free to use those. I just wanted to start, and I don't know whether I'm just... And maybe you want to comment on this, but I just think maybe a little bit of context here is a little bit important as we start the conversation. Because when we talk about plain language summaries, plain language podcasts, and all this, we've got to be a bit careful with the terminology and the language, because people often hear plain language equals patients, for instance. And I'm personally, fond of talking about how plain language doesn't just mean patients, it's opening up access to a wider group of people, some of whom happen to be patients. Okay, so let's just be a little bit careful with that sort of thing. And I think, Caroline, you made it very clear that your podcasts are involving the patients, but they're for HCPs and things like this. We just got to be a little bit careful with some of the answers to some of the questions, I think, as we might get a bit muddled with that. If that's a fair point. You're sort of nodding at me, but I just think there's a bit of danger in there that we go plain language. What we're talking about is patients. And yes, today I'd like to talk a bit more about the patients than anything else, but let's just be a little bit careful with the terminology. And I know you were talking about plain language patient-centered podcasts, which is quite that's a constructed label, isn't it? Let's face it, which is addressing what I'm just trying to say there. Okay. So let's pick up a couple of the questions. In fact, there's a whole bunch of them now coming in. Okay, so let's just run through some of these very quickly. Who wants to answer some of these questions? There's a question here about the timeline for producing a PLS podcast as opposed to a written PLS. Just give us a sense. Can someone give us a sense? What's the timeline? Is it longer, shorter, whatever? Who was talking timelines? Simon, I think you were talking timelines.
So with our example, the podcast was a little bit longer because this was the first time it was done. Neve might be able to advise maybe from the from other experiences now, but yeah, 6 months was longer than the average time for PLS.
Yeah, we've had one that we published. It wasn't a plain language podcast, but it was a podcast article, and it was 10 weeks from the conception to the online publication. So they can be really fast or they can take longer. But
like
yeah,
everything.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
That's the problem, isn't it? People want to make timelines, but actually there's a whole bunch of processes in there.
Exactly.
On that point, I know people hate me asking these sorts of questions. Okay, it's lovely having a case history like this. Okay, and we've been talking about podcasts for years. Yeah, and it's always like there aren't very many examples. We talk about it, it's all possible, but it's lovely to have an example. Okay, but just give us a sense, and Neve, from your point of view as a publisher, is this a one-off? I mean, you're talking about you can do it, but just give me a sense, if I may put you on the spot. Are we talking about occasional, often, lots? Just give me a sense. I know,
Yeah.
you won't want me to pin you down too much, but give me a sense.
No, it's a good question. So in terms of podcast articles, we've been publishing them for about 2 or 3 years. And I think we will definitely publish upwards of, it must be between 20 to 30 now. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but they are popular, and we are seeing more and more of them. I don't think it's just a one-off, and I hope that we'll be able to do more patient-authored plain language ones moving forward.
Okay, so just a little, it just helps have a little bit of a sense. James asked a question about the podcast. I must admit, I just made an assumption. By podcast, you're talking audio only.
So we have got a vodcast example, but the thing
you're calling
that
that something different, yeah? So yeah, we need to, again, the terminology gets a bit confusing, isn't it?
Exactly. You have to bear in mind the thing with the podcast article. So it's mainly audio only, and we have had ways. People want to do the vodcast version, but you have to remember that these go onto Spotify and Apple Podcasts, where there is no option for visual. So you have to, in that case, still make the podcast understandable without seeing the visual on screen, if that makes sense. So there's the option to do both, but you just have to bear that aspect in mind.
But the terminology, I mean, I would assume if someone said podcast to me, that's audio, as opposed to, you're calling it a podcast, which I have to say I've not heard of before, but it's like a video. Is different sort of thing. But again, the terminology all gets mixed up with everybody. Just actually, just what you just said there. And again, sorry, I don't know who the best person is to answer, but Neve, I'm aiming at you. You're saying with the podcast and your transcript with it. I'm always a little intrigued. You said something like it's easy for people who prefer to read a transcript. And I just wonder whether you have any sense of whether people really do read a transcript or not, because I find transcripts can be quite difficult, frankly. Go Neve, and then Caroline wants to say something. Yeah, but Neve, go on first.
Yeah, I mean, Caroline, I'll let Caroline answer more of this, but okay. we have had one example. So as I mentioned, we can see metrics of kind of how many people have accessed the article, how many people have played the audio within it. And we've had one where the metrics were really high in terms of who was accessing the article, but the actual people playing on it, like pressing the audio, was quite low. So the people that were accessing this were preferring to read through it. I personally prefer to read a transcript just because of the way it's set out, but that's obviously my own personal preference. I don't know, Caroline, if you have any more to add to that.
Yeah, we've had the same feedback actually. Now my role is, I'm part of lots of sort of like multi-format omni-channel educational programs, and we've had the same sort of feedback where actually there's lots of people clicking onto the podcasts, but people are looking for bite size, and they'll either come back multiple times to listen to bites, but it's more the transcripts. And when we dug into more of this, it's more because, and maybe this is the depressing state of our world, but no one's got time to listen to 20 to 30 minutes, but the transcript allows you to skip to the right bits. So you can go on SpringerLink, but you can go on to any platform that has podcast that has a transcript. If you're just interested in the lung cancer data, just search for the lung in the transcript, it'll bring it up, and it's so much quicker to scan through it. And then if you're interested and want to hear the discussion, then you know the right bit of the podcast to click into. So yeah, feedback is, I think that's why multi-format's really important for these podcasts, but actually not just for the listenability. Thinking about the metrics, thinking about how most people use Google as the way that they search for scientific literature, the transcript is the tool that brings the podcast up to the top of Google search engine optimization. So it's an incredible tool for highlighting the podcast as well as accessibility.
On that point, do you attempt to break things down into chapters and things? Do you provide links so that halfway down the transcript, that's the bit I'm interested, ping straight at that bit of the podcast? I mean, that's all possible, but do you do that or not? I suspect you don't, to be honest, but what stage are you at with that?
So we've done one in the past. So the way that they kind of look, if people look through the example, is while it's audio only, it's a video. So there tends to be a like a holding slide, I suppose, that just maybe has details of the authors or the title on it. What we have done once before, and we have got, you know, potential projects and moving forward where we're going to do this, is put break it into the chapters and put at what minute that starts, so then somebody can scroll through to the specific part that they're interested in.
Having played a bit with that sort of thing, it can take up an awful lot of time. And I think that's why most people don't actually do it. But it's incredibly useful if you can do it properly, and it encourages the accessibility to a huge degree. I'm sorry, James has talked about we talk about running times for podcasts. Again, sorry, I'm going to be very blunt. When people talk about 30 minutes is the right time for a podcast because it fits in with the commute, I always go a little bit sort of like this, because I don't commute, so that's irrelevant to me. And how long is a commute? It could be 5 minutes or 2 hours or something. I find those sorts of comments a little bit odd, I have to say. And I just wonder whether you've got a little bit more sense or insight into how long these things, rather than just go, because that is a bit arbitrary. Go on, Caroline.
Yes, recently, well, over the last 2 years, actually, Springer Healthcare have been extensively surveying healthcare professionals in terms of like, where do they like to access education, what format's the best, and apparently a big turn-off is education that's more than 20 minutes. I say big turn off, I might be exaggerating. We just asked like, what would make you turn on or turn off? So 20 minutes seems to be what got by far the most votes, and that does kind of link in with what we see in terms of metrics for our podcasts.
So you're saying 20 sort of thing. So I mean, I think we can go down a rabbit hole here. I don't intend to, but I mean, part of my argument with people is if you can sit and watch 10 hours of flipping Netflix series, whatever, because you're interested in it, then, you know, why have you only got 10 minutes for my incredibly important bit of education, or 20 or 22, or whatever it is? And I think a lot of it actually does come down to how engaging it is and how important it is to the person. And it's not just about numbers, not just about going, look, most people will come in. Actually, what you want to do is get to the right people. And if they're interested enough and you do it properly, then you can hook their attention, can't you? I think it's a little bit easy to go, everyone's attention span is very short. So because they're sitting there watching Netflix for the next 10 weeks.
I agree with you to a certain extent, Peter, and you're right, it has to be engaging. And I think the way that we are the decision-making process for what types of education we delve into is changing for sure. But I do think there's a difference between, at the end of the day, getting back from work and binge watching The Crown, to think about the statistic that I heard recently, that whatever field you're into as a doctor, to keep up to date with what's going on in your field, you need to be reading. I think the latest statistic was 21 peer-reviewed articles per day. So that's kind of different, you know. We can binge Netflix, but a lot of it's just fluff. But actually trying to get an expert who's under supreme pressure to keep up to date with the field, it needs to be engaging. But I think quick snapshots, like bullet size, bite size, digestible content, I think is important.
Let's kind of switch back to the Envision guys. Simon, Catherine, I mean, there's been several questions coming in terms of, I think the picture you painted was you would identify a conference, say conference sessions, you had specialist input to that, and then you sent patient authors to cover those conferences. Just what practically are the challenges there? Because are the patients able to handle it? Because they've got to listen to a specialist presentation and then interpret it. So how difficult it is to find the right sorts of authors and so on? Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Absolutely.
Simon, let's just go with you. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think this comes back to, again, in those conversations really early on. And, you know, we worked in this example with a healthcare professional with expertise in kidney and bladder cancer, but also a patient advocate involved in national and international patient advocacy organisations related to kidney and bladder cancer. And then again, it was looking at the sessions and looking what was most aligned to those kinds of expertise. So our patient advocate author attended the patient advocacy tracks, and the health professionals, sort of the allied health professionals, looking at self-management and those kinds of topics, as well as some of the more clinical and basic science. But it's also understanding what people's preferences and expertise is, not underlying that, you know, patient advocates had a lot of expertise as well. So it's bringing all that together, and then the important part after that collection was then discussing it as a group, and you know, the clinician author sharing his expertise and his experience at the sessions in a way that was understandable through everybody on the call. So again, it is that open communication, which is just really, really important.
And I think, Simon, from your side, was there any, sorry. I was just wondering, is there anything that you had to work differently to work with the patient that you worked with, or versus the HCP? Were there any kind of different briefings or anything that you needed?
Again, it was just we communicated everything in plain language, including to our healthcare professional author, because again, that is best practice to make sure everyone's on the same page. And I think I'm just conscious that, you know, we refer to patient author, and it's a bit of a, you know, we don't refer to HCP authors as one group of people. I think this is really important. And a question lots of people have that, you know, we you know, this example is we work with a patient advocate who was attending the Congress and felt comfortable in that process, and there's lots of opportunities and there's lots of ways that this can be done with groups of people. So again, just for people to be conscious that, you know, it's not just a patient, not just a healthcare professional who represent all of their you know, their cohort of people.
I think that's really, really important point that actually comes up a lot when we're talking about patient communications and so on. We're going to run out of time in a minute, and I just want a couple of quick questions. One is an inevitable, and I don't think we're going to answer this very much, but I'm just, who's going to react to this? There's been a couple of questions coming up. How do you define plain language? You know, it's an easy word to use, and then, well, what does plain language mean? I mean, how do you as a writer, as a judge, and how do you have those conversations with your HCPs about what level we're actually talking about? Is it possible to give us a sense of that from your point of view? You want to say that, Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, think from when we're working about it, we're thinking about who are the broader audiences as well. So is it going to a scientific journal, in which case you might not want to go down to sort of a reading age of, say, 11 or so. But if you're aiming content at, you know, say children, for example, then it's a very different situation than from a scientific journal plain language summary. So it's very much about the situation and just making sure that everything is understandable by a broad range of people. It's not just about, you know, for patients, it's not just about for kind of expert HCPs.
Because again, that's not just a group, it's just that there's a spectrum of activity. I see someone has to make a judgment. Just to finish off, and again, there's several questions about it. So Catherine, you know, what about compliance issues from pharma and so on? Do you just want to say, we can't avoid saying a few words about the compliance side of things? What are the challenges there?
I mean, in this particular, in the podcast perspective, I'm thinking Simon
just
might
generally, maybe. Okay, either the specific example. Let's take the specific example.
So Simon, was anything from your side? Sorry.
Again, the purpose of this content is to educate a broader audience. So I think it was on those very clear discussions up front and making sure that all authors, patient advocate and HCP, follow ICMJE authorship criteria, just as we do through any publication, and those processes in place. So, you know, people with lived experience can co-author publications, as we've already been alluding to, and GPP 2022, you know, supports that practicality. So again, it's clear upfront discussion from the start about roles and responsibilities, so that all authors, regardless of background, can author materials like the podcast.
Yeah. And in terms of plain language summaries, when we're working with clients to start working on these as well, we often have a lot of conversations with them around the legal, you know, requirements from their side, but also making sure that we are following a process which actually, you know, makes sense from an internal perspective, but also, you know, meets all the sort of good publication practice requirements as well. So, you know, are there any disclaimers or et cetera that they need to include, and make sure that obviously everyone is kind of getting involved.
Okay. Look, we ought to draw the line next. We're slightly over time. And I'm going to ignore that question, come back to it in a second. I'm going to say a big thank you to you. Sorry, we are running out of time. We've got a lot of questions here, actually. So look, members of the audience, don't run away, because we'll be here for another few minutes yet. But for the purposes of the recording, I'd like to say a huge thank you to the panel for joining us. Make the point to anybody in the audience, but also anyone watching this video later. Please reach out to each other. Part of the point of these webinars is to make contact. And I know I can speak for the panel. Everybody's very happy to hear people, have people reach out on LinkedIn is the easy way of doing it, okay? So I'm going to, just for the sake of the moment, stop the recording there. I'm going to ask the panelists to say goodbye, but as I say, audience members, hang around. We've got a few minutes still to talk, but thank you very much. If anybody wants to know what I'm up to, medcommsnetworking.com, and give me a shout if I can help. But thank you, panelists. Let's just give a little wave. Thank you. Bye.